Do you ever wonder why peace feels like a stranger, even in moments of stillness? Why silence doesn't soothe you, but rather sharpens the noise within? It is not because the world is too loud, but because you've become too tuned to its static, every whisper of expectation, every distant echo of judgment. From the moment we wake, we begin performing, not for applause, not even for affection, but to stay within the lines society has drawn for us in invisible ink. We live calculating, rehearsing, pleasing, and when the performance is flawless, we feel emptier than ever. Montaigne, in the solitude of his stone tower, understood something most of us fear to admit. The tighter you cling to order, the further you drift from yourself. Worry is not caution, it is an addiction to illusion. The illusion that if we care more, plan more, control more, then maybe we'll finally feel safe. But safety at the cost of authenticity is the cruelest form of exile. What you call worry is often just a disguise for the fear of being seen as you truly are, flawed, uncertain, unpredictable. But that unpolished version of you is the only version that's real. This isn't about giving up. It's about giving in to the flow of life that refuses to be managed, measured, or mastered. When you stop worrying, you don't become careless. You become conscious. And in that consciousness lies the beginning of something extraordinary. Not a perfect life, but a genuine one. The one you were always meant to live before worry taught you to hide. The prison we build in plain sight. You weren't born cautious. You didn't enter the world afraid of what others thought. That came later, taught not in lectures but in glances, comments, and quiet punishments for stepping out of line. Bit by bit, without realizing it, you began constructing a version of yourself that fit the mold. And slowly, the real you started retreating. Not out of weakness, but out of survival. We don't notice the walls going up. They look like compromise. They feel like politeness. We call them being realistic. But eventually we find ourselves inside something we don't understand, living a life that looks fine on the outside, but feels strangely hollow. We go along with plans we didn't choose, adopt values we don't question, and accept relationships that drain more than they give. There is no key in this prison. Because the door was never locked, the real trap is internal, our belief that to be accepted, we must be small, that to be safe, we must silence what's true. It's a form of exile, one we justify with logic that sounds mature, even noble. But it's not nobility, it's avoidance. Every time you hesitate to speak your truth because you fear the reaction, you reinforce the walls. Every time you perform instead of express, you lose another thread of your essence. And yet, no one asked you to do it. That's the paradox. No one demanded your silence, no one mandated your disguise, but still, you obeyed, quietly, consistently, until the performance replaced the person. What's terrifying is not that you're trapped, it's that you got used to it. Montaigne didn't speak of rebellion through noise or defiance. He pointed instead to a subtler revolution, remembering what was forgotten. It is the beginning of escape, not from others, but from the version of yourself you thought you needed to become. The first step isn't a dramatic leap. It's an honest look inward, a single moment of admitting, this life doesn't reflect me. Only from there can anything real begin. 2. The illusion that keeps you restless. It always starts with the idea that things could go wrong, that if you don't act now, if you don't prepare better, if you don't anticipate every variable, something will unravel. And so you plan, you measure, you imagine worst-case scenarios in vivid detail. You call it responsibility. Others call it being careful. But inside, it doesn't feel like care. It feels like exhaustion. Control is comforting in theory. It gives the impression that you're doing something, that your effort protects you. But that feeling doesn't last, because the moment one part of life obeys your will, another falls out of step. You fix your schedule, but your relationships grow distant. You succeed at work, but sleep eludes you. You hold one string tightly, while a dozen others slip from your hand. We weren't designed to carry everything, and yet we try. The The real reason we chase control is fear, not of chaos, but of vulnerability. When life moves outside your grip, you are reminded that you're not immune to loss, that anything you love could change, that nothing is promised. So you tighten your routines, you build systems, you tell yourself that order will keep you safe. But beneath all that is a whisper you ignore. You're still scared. Montaigne saw through this centuries ago. He realized that life is not something you master. It is something you meet, with openness, with flexibility, with the understanding that uncertainty is not the enemy. The enemy is your refusal to face it. What if letting go is not the end of responsibility, but the beginning of clarity? What if the most honest form of strength is the ability to stand in the unknown without panicking? Control may feel like a strategy, but in truth, it's a ritual of delay, postponing the experience of living until every variable is known. And by the time that moment comes, the life you were meant to inhabit will have passed unclaimed. 3. The inheritance you never asked for. By the time we reach adulthood, much of who we are has been shaped for us. Our thoughts are colored by the culture we absorb. Our ambitions mirror those around us. Even our preferences, we later discover, were quietly influenced by praise, criticism, or imitation. Somewhere along the way, we began to confuse what we've absorbed with what we actually believe. This confusion breeds anxiety, not because we lack direction, but because we're following one that isn't ours. We say we want success, but often it's a version handed to us before we knew how to question it. We chase relationships, but many times for the image they create, not the connection they offer. And then we wonder why our joy feels temporary, why achievements lose their thrill, why even the things we fought to have feel hollow once they're ours. Identity that depends on external alignment will always feel fragile. If you derive your sense of worth from applause, you'll become a slave to its sound. If you define your progress by how others measure it, your life will never feel like your own. The task, then, is not to achieve more. It is to subtract what was never truly yours. This isn't a process of destruction, it's one of return. Return to a quieter place where your voice hasn't yet been distorted. That voice may be faint at first, but it's still there. It's been buried under the noise of adaptation, but not erased. Montaigne's wisdom doesn't tell you what to think. It invites you to ask, who was I before I was taught who to be? When you stop worrying about how others will see you, something rare happens. You start to see yourself, not the version edited for approval, but the raw, uncertain, luminous self that never needed permission to exist. 4. The distance created by attachment. It's a strange truth that the more tightly we cling to something, the more distorted it becomes in our mind. Love turns into possession, ambition morphs into obsession. Even joy becomes a task to maintain rather than a moment to savor. This transformation doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in gradually as attachment begins to blur into anxiety. At first, it seems harmless. You care about someone and you want them close. You find purpose in your work and you want it to succeed. These are natural instincts, but slowly that wanting deepens into fear. Fear of loss, of rejection, of not being enough. The line between affection and need starts to vanish. What once inspired you begins to control you. You start building conditions. As long as this person stays, you think. As long as this situation doesn't change. And just like that, your peace becomes conditional on a reality you can't guarantee. We often confuse attachment with love, but genuine love doesn't demand permanence. It exists freely, without needing control. It flows rather than binds. The same goes for purpose, creativity, or success. When you become dependent on their outcomes to validate your worth, they stop being expressions of who you are and become cages you can't leave. Montaigne understood this nuance. He saw that what binds us is rarely the object itself. It is our refusal to accept that everything changes, that people leave, that roles shift, that certainty is a myth. and that it's precisely this impermanence that makes life vivid. Detachment is not apathy. It is engagement without fear. It's walking with open hands rather than clenched fists. It is choosing presence over possession. And in that choice, there is an unexpected reward. Things become more beautiful when you no longer need them to stay. What if you stopped demanding guarantees from life? What if instead you allowed things to come and go without making them responsible for your stability? Then, for the first time, you might actually experience what it means to be free. 5. The fiction we call success. There's a story you've been told since you were a child. It goes something like this. Work hard, follow the rules, impress the right people, and eventually you'll arrive at something called success. It's never fully defined, but it's implied to be a destination, a place where struggle ends and satisfaction begins. You believed in that story. You probably still do on some level. So you climbed the ladder. You collected credentials, achievements, and symbols of progress. You made sacrifices, some small, some you don't like to speak about. And now you're here, higher than you've ever been. But something feels off. The view from the top is supposed to feel glorious. Instead, it feels distant. You look around and realize you don't remember choosing this path. You just didn't know there were other ones. You kept going because stopping seemed irresponsible. You pursued goals because they were praised, not because they stirred your soul. And now you're beginning to suspect that the version of success you were sold may not be yours. Real success isn't about scale. It isn't about visibility. It's about alignment. Do your actions reflect your values? Does your work energize you or drain you? Do your relationships nourish your spirit or simply fill your calendar? We live in a culture that rewards performance more than presence, that applauds results more than reflection. But Montaigne, in his quiet solitude, arrived at a truth that still eludes many today. Success without self is just another form of loss. You don't need to renounce ambition. You need to interrogate it. Ask it who it serves. Ask it what it costs. If the price is your peace, your integrity, your joy, then maybe it's not a bargain worth making. What if your greatest success could be found not at the end of a race, but in the decision to walk a different road altogether? 6. The power. Hidden in your story. Every day you narrate your life. Not aloud, not always consciously, but through the way you interpret your experiences. When something goes wrong, you might say, I always mess things up. When something good happens, you might think, I got lucky this time. These aren't facts, they're scripts. And over time, they become the architecture of your reality. We assume that thoughts are reflections of truth. But often, they are just echoes of the past, repeated so often that they begin to sound like fact. Maybe someone once told you that you weren't enough, and now your inner voice repeats it. Maybe a single failure convinced you that risk equals danger, and now you plan your life around avoidance. This internal narrative matters more than we realize. It doesn't just shape how we feel. It influences what we attempt, how we connect, and whether we ever truly allow ourselves to grow. Montaigne believed in self-inquiry not as a luxury, but as a necessity. To live without questioning the story you live by is to surrender authorship. It is to act out a script written by others and call it destiny. Rewriting your story doesn't require dramatic changes. It begins with noticing. When you think, I can't handle this, pause. Ask, is that true? Or just familiar? The mind doesn't change overnight, but each time you disrupt an old script, you weaken its grip. Each time you choose a more compassionate explanation, you reclaim a little more freedom. What if you're not as broken as you think? What if you've simply been believing in a version of yourself that was never accurate to begin with? There is a quiet kind of transformation that begins when you treat your inner voice not as a tyrant, but as a guide waiting to be retrained. The brain is not the enemy. It is a narrator that repeats what it's heard most often. Change what you feed it, and the tone of your entire life will shift. You don't need to silence your fear. You only need to let your truth speak louder. Over time, a new story emerges, not one dictated by wounds or warnings, but by a gentler confidence rooted in clarity. Your future is not a continuation of your past unless you let it be. You can always pause mid-sentence, revise the narrative, and write the next chapter differently. That is not fantasy. That is the quiet revolution of reclaiming authorship. 7. The unknown as an invitation. There's a part of you that wants certainty, that wants to know how the story ends before you commit to living it. That part fears mistakes, detours, and pain, and so it clings to routine, to predictability, to anything that promises safety. It tells you that curiosity is dangerous, that risk is irresponsible, that not knowing is a weakness. But there's another part, quieter, harder to hear. It's the part that lights up when you imagine freedom, when you remember who you were before fear started editing your dreams. That part doesn't care about guarantees. It wants experience. It wants truth. These two parts often clash. One builds fences, the other dreams of open fields. One wants comfort, the other seeks growth. And your life becomes the space where they negotiate, where you either choose security or aliveness. Montaigne didn't offer answers. He offered perspective. He reminded us that the unknown isn't an enemy, it's a teacher. That the future doesn't need to be foreseen in order to be faced. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway. The most important steps in life often come without assurance. You won't be ready. You won't be certain, but you'll know when it's time. Stepping into the unknown doesn't mean abandoning logic. It means honoring possibility. It means trusting that while you cannot predict every outcome, you are capable of meeting whatever comes. The edge of what you know is not a wall, it's a doorway. And the life that waits on the other side doesn't need you to have a plan. It needs you to have the willingness to walk through, and it helps to remember. The version of you that emerges in the unknown will not be the same one that entered. That's the gift of uncertainty. It reveals parts of you that predictability never requires, strength that comfort never tests, wisdom that familiarity cannot summon. You may stumble, you may lose your balance, but you'll also grow in ways control never allowed. And perhaps that's the quiet miracle of life outside the familiar. It expands you, not with drama, but with depth. So next time you feel resistance, pause. Ask yourself whether it's fear or intuition, and if it's fear, step forward anyway. Not recklessly, but bravely. Because everything real begins in the space where you stop needing to know and start daring to feel. You have spent your life gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on a horizon shaped by someone else's dreams. You've micromanaged emotions, curated responses, armored your soul in politeness and perfection, all in the name of safety. And yet, peace has eluded you. Not because you weren't disciplined enough, not because you failed to try hard enough, but because the map you followed never led to yourself. Montaigne didn't preach escape. He modeled return. A return not to society's stage, but to the quiet backstage of the soul. There, in the stillness, you discover a truth so radical it's unsettling. You were never meant to carry this much. Not the weight of every outcome, not the burden of being understood by everyone, not the exhausting obligation to be constantly agreeable, prepared, invulnerable. Letting go isn't weakness. It's the bravest kind of clarity. It's looking your fear in the eye and saying, "You no longer get to shape my decisions." It's allowing your identity to be sculpted not by habit or expectation, but by something infinitely more honest, your own aliveness. When you stop worrying, the world doesn't necessarily change, but your way of walking through it does. You begin to listen to your inner weather instead of the world's forecast. You begin to act not out of obligation, but out of alignment. You begin to say no without guilt and yes without fear. And slowly what once felt like a storm becomes a rhythm. Not perfect, but yours. This is not the end. This is the invitation. To stop rehearsing your life and start living it. To step into uncertainty, not with dread, but with curiosity. To trust that what you lose when you stop worrying is far less important than what you gain, yourself. So now ask yourself, not someday, not next year, but here, in this breath, are you ready to stop worrying and finally come home?